Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the US Secretary of State says that the US is set on working closer with Nigeria on security and in the fight against religious extremism in West Africa. President Tinubu meets with Antony Blinken as the top US diplomat continues his 4-stop Africa tour. Also, Tunisia continues to face calls to drop charges against several jailed political dissidents who've been held for months without the setting of a trial date. The supporters and families say that they're facing trumped-up accusations. And AFCON is almost exhausting with its unpredictability at this point. Cameroon is just through to the final 16 after squeezing out a victory over the tenacious Gambia 3-2. This is Senegal beats Guinea 2-0. We hear from our man in Ivory Coast. But first, Nigeria says that President Bola Tinubu discussed regional security and the conflict in Gaza with the US Secretary of State as he arrived in Abuja on the latest leg of his 4-country tour of the continent. Antony Blinken has already visited Cape Verde and Ivory Coast and is next due in Angola.
A second stop of a 4-nation swing in Africa. Top of the agenda on Antony Blinken's talks with President Alassane Ouattara, security and stability. The US Secretary of State praised Ivory Coast's efforts against jihadist threats in the Sahel, pledging additional funding for the country.
We're announcing $45 billion in new funding through the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability for coastal West African states. And we're also working to bolster Côte d'Ivoire's security capacity. There's been a increase in training multiplied 15 times, training equipment for the military just over the last year. We're expanding civilian forces investment as well.
The funding will be in addition to the $300 million the US has already invested in West African security over the past 2 years. But security is not the only issue on the table. The US is seeking to bolster partnerships with the continent on numerous fronts, including trade, climate, infrastructure and health. Washington says it remains intent on forging a united front with key African democracies, which not only hold vast economic potential, but are also a locus of great power competition with China and Russia.
Well, Congolese leader Felix Tshisekedi says that he's successfully reworked a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure for minerals deal with Chinese investors that has, so far, failed to live up to Congolese expectations. The president says that the reassessment and amendment to the 2008 venture will deliver more for his country, but there's still concerns about the transparency of the negotiations. Emmett Livingston tells us more from Kinshasa.
President Tshisekedi is holding up this renegotiated deal as evidence that he's serious about putting DR Congolese economic interests first. In a surprise announcement, he said he'd revisited the terms of a huge Chinese mining agreement that would now bring in $7 billion of investment. The original deal was signed in 2008 under Tshisekedi's predecessor, Joseph Kabila, and it provided for Chinese investors spending $3 billion on infrastructure in Congo. In return, the investors received the proceeds from a copper and cobalt mine known as Sicomine. But according to Congo's state auditor, the investors spent very little money on infrastructure since 2008, while the Sicomine mine has been operational and generating profits. The auditor also said the mine had been undervalued and that the investors should therefore spend billions more on infrastructure. Tshisekedi made rebalancing the deal, which he called unfavorable towards Congo, as one of his priorities last year, even traveling to Beijing for talks. The president has now said the rebalanced deal will lead to $7 billion in investments, which is a huge sum representing about half of the country's budget this year. He said the money would be spent on building roads. But numerous questions surround this latest announcement. Analysts have criticized the lack of transparency in which the deal was negotiated, for example. And one source with knowledge of the discussions said there had been no new study of the mine's reserves. He said that the renegotiation was still likely undervalued, and I quote, catastrophic for Congo.
In Tunisia, the space for political debate and dissent is shrinking. More than 50 people have been in prison without trial for months for alleged conspiracy against state security or accused of spreading false information. Most are political opponents of President Kais Saied, and their families say that they're facing unfounded accusations. The Ministry of Justice has generally avoided publicly commenting on the cases. Our team tells us more.
Every day, one of Abir Musi's lawyers comes to the Manouba women's prison to visit her. I visit Abiy Moussi to exchange updates with her about her case.
She's the leader of a political party and an opponent of President Sayed. Moussi is facing prosecution for several vague offenses against the government that could carry the death penalty. But she remains politically engaged.
Her morale is high, she's a fighter, and she gives instructions for the party, the Free Destroying Party.
We don't have authorization to film the prison, but as he's leaving, Nafa Al-Aribi gives us a message from his client.
She believes she's the victim of political violence, which aims to exclude her from the presidential elections, which should be held at the end of 2024.
Other opponents without electoral ambitions have been imprisoned for almost a year. Along with 6 others, Jawher Ben Mbarak has been accused of conspiring against state security. One Sunday night, his sister and father are preparing food to take to him in prison.
The food they are given in prison is disgusting and inedible. So we have to make food for my brother and his cellmates.
Putting together the basket brings back painful memories for his father. He spent 6 years as a political prisoner in 1973. 50 years later, and it's now his son behind bars.
It's awful talking to my son on the phone. I can't touch him. I can't hug him.
Human rights organizations have condemned the number of Tunisians in arbitrary detention and facing charges without evidence. Dates have not been set for many trials, and pre-trial detention can legally last up to 14 months.
That's the limit for the first part, and after that we go to the second part, which is the indictment chamber, which will assess the charges according to the investigating judge, and that is not limited by time.
The government has been almost completely silent on the conspiracy cases, and in a rare parliamentary hearing on January 16th, the Minister of Justice dismissed a question about it, insisting that they don't talk about it.
Well, the drama of AFCON continues, and there may well no longer be any small teams on the continent. Cameroon scraped through to the last 16 after a 3-2 win over the Gambia. But for a nation that's won the Africa Cup of Nations 5 times, it's a pretty unsatisfying showing. Coach Rigobert Song has come in for some flack at home. Our James Vazenap brings us more from Ivory Coast.
The madness just keeps coming here in the Ivory Coast. This edition of the Africa Cup of Nations is absolutely incredible. The games are just everything coming in the last minutes. We almost got a major upset, but in the end, Cameroon came to get what they were needing. They got a win, 3-2 over the Gambia, but it was not easy for them, especially in the first half. The Gambia were definitely the best of the two sides, but in the end, as Cameroon managed to get the finals goals, and then the Gambia, who started leading finally at 1 point just for a minute before Cameroon put in an equaliser before getting a winner after that. The crowds went absolutely wild. The Gambia have not been performing as they did last time round. Last time round, in their first Africa Cup of Nations, they got all the way to the quarterfinals in what was their first time playing at the tournament, which was already incredible. This time, they've been a little bit quieter, but Tom Saintfiet's team tonight definitely showed that fighting spirit that they held the whole time, and they really deserved to go really far, because that's what they are. They are fighters in that, never giving up. They slowed down a little bit towards the end of the game, but you wouldn't be able to hold that against them, because it is getting really hot for the players after those 90 minutes. But very much they were playing on the counter-attack, and then when it had to come, it came, and they managed to slip past them. But in the end, it was a goal from Cameroon that came and just managed to slide past the Gambia's massive goalkeeper, Boubacar Gueye, who unfortunately for him let in that goal, and from then all things started to change.
Thanks for that, James. Well, in Monday afternoon's other game, Senegal are also through after topping Group C with a 2-0 win over Guinea. And Mauritania is currently facing Algeria's Desert Foxes at the Bouaké Stadium, with the score there with Algeria leading 1-0 and with Mauritania, leading 1-0. And Angola is playing Burkina Faso in Yamoussoukro. Angola is leading 1-0 there. That is all we have time for Eye on Africa for now. Join me, though, in 45 minutes when I'm back with more. Thanks for joining us, though. Take care.
Move to the rhythms of Africa. The Africa Cup of Nations from January the 13th to February the 11th on France 24.